Sometimes the only thing left worth owning is a piece of ground nobody else wants. For a man who's lost everything, even $10 feels like gambling on hope. Eli, a weathered cowboy with more years behind him than ahead, bought an abandoned ranch for $10, sight unseen. It was all he could afford. He rode out to collect his only companion, a donkey named Clover, and what few memories he could carry. But when he returned weeks later, ready to start over, he found 4 women living in his house, strangers, each carrying scars, stories, and their own claim to his land. What happens when 5 broken souls meet on ground none of them truly owns? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auction had been held in a dusty courthouse basement 3 counties over. The kind of place where fluorescent lights hummed too loud, and the air smelled of old paper and regret. Eli Thorne had sat in the back row, his hat resting on his knee, watching as parcels of land nobody wanted were sold off to pay debts nobody could settle. Most of the bidders were developers or lawyers, men in clean shirts who saw opportunity where others saw only dust and distance. Eli wasn't looking for opportunity. He was looking for a place to die with some dignity intact. At 64, he'd spent 40 years working ranches that weren't his, breaking horses for men who paid him just enough to keep moving, sleeping in bunkhouses that all looked the same after a while. His back hurt most mornings now, a grinding ache that started in his lower spine and worked its way up through his shoulders. His hands were gnarled from decades of rope work and winter cold. He'd saved what he could, but medical bills from a heart scare 2 years back had cleaned him out. He had $347 to his name, a donkey named Clover that nobody else wanted, and a duffel bag containing 2 changes of clothes, a photograph of his mother, and a leather journal he'd kept since he was 20, the auctioneer, a thin man with reading glasses perched on his nose, had droned through property after property. Eli hadn't raised his hand once. He was there because he had nowhere else to be, because the winter wind outside was sharp enough to cut through his worn jacket, and because the courthouse was warm. Then the auctioneer had called out Lot 47, abandoned ranch property, 160 acres, northwestern corner of Hayes County. Structure on site, condition unknown. Water rights unclear. No power, no maintained road access. Minimum bid $10. The room had gone quiet. Even the developers knew a losing proposition when they heard one. Eli had felt something stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of possibility. He'd raised his hand. $10, he'd said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The auctioneer had looked up, surprised. Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back. Just like that, Eli Thorne became a landowner. The bill of sale had been processed by a bored clerk who barely looked at him. Eli had counted out 10 $1 bills from his wallet, bills so worn and soft they felt like cloth. The clerk had stamped the papers, slid them across the counter, and told him the deed would be mailed within 6 weeks. "You know where this property is?" the clerk had asked. "I'll find it," Eli had said. That had been 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks of working odd jobs, mending fences, mucking stalls, anything that paid cash. 6 weeks of sleeping in his truck or in the hayloft of a barn outside Billings, where the owner let him stay in exchange for morning chores. 6 weeks of making his way north, following a hand-drawn map the county clerk had sketched on the back of a gas station receipt, and 6 weeks of trying not to think too hard about what he'd find when he got there. Clover had been waiting for him at the Hendersons' place, a small ranch where Eli had worked the previous spring. Mrs. Henderson had agreed to keep the donkey while Eli sorted himself out, though she'd made it clear she was doing it as a favor. "Not a service. That animal eats more than my husband," she'd said when Eli came to collect him. Clover was 17 years old, grey around the muzzle, stubborn as a rusted bolt, and the closest thing to family Eli had left. He'd bought the donkey from a trader in Arizona 12 years back, after the trader admitted he was planning to sell Clover for meat. Eli had paid $40 he couldn't afford, and Clover had been his traveling companion ever since. "You ready, old man?" Eli had murmured, scratching Clover behind the ears. The donkey had snorted, his breath steaming in the morning air, and butted his head against Eli's chest. They'd set out at dawn, Eli riding an old mare he'd borrowed from the Hendersons, Clover tethered behind with a lead rope. The journey took 3 days. They followed dirt roads that turned to gravel, then gravel roads that turned to dirt again. They passed through towns that were barely towns anymore, just a gas station and a post office, maybe a diner that opened 4 days a week. The land stretched out in all directions, empty and vast, the kind of emptiness that made a man feel both small and strangely at peace. On the 3rd night, Eli camped beside a creek that ran clear and cold. He made a small fire, heated a can of beans, and shared half with Clover. The stars came out sharp and bright, more stars than a man could count in a lifetime. Eli sat with his back against a cottonwood tree and let himself imagine what the ranch might look like. In his mind, it was modest but sound. A cabin with 4 walls, a roof that didn't leak, maybe a barn where he could keep Clover out of the weather. He'd fix what needed fixing, plant a garden come spring, live quietly. He didn't need much. He never had. The next morning they reached the property. The road leading to the ranch was barely a road at all, just 2 ruts through the grass that could have been made by anything, a tractor, a truck, the passage of years. Eli dismounted and led the mare and Clover on foot, his boots crunching on stones, his breath visible in the cold October air. The land opened up before him in a wide valley ringed by low hills. There were ponderosa pines scattered along the ridges, their bark glowing amber in the late afternoon light. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, its banks lined with willow and alder. The grass was tall and golden, rippling in the wind like a living thing, and there in the center of it all was the house. Eli stopped walking. It was bigger than he'd imagined. 2 stories, built from logs that had weathered to a silver gray. The roof was metal, rusted but still intact. There was a wide porch across the front, the boards sagging in places, and a brick chimney rising from the center of the house. The windows were dark and empty, like the eyes of something that had stopped watching a long time ago. But what caught Eli's attention, what made his heart sink and his jaw tighten, was the thin column of smoke rising from the chimney. Someone was inside. Eli stood there for a long moment, the wind tugging at his coat, Clover shifting restlessly behind him. He felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He'd known on some level that $10 was too cheap. He'd known there had to be a catch. But he'd bought the property legally, had the papers to prove it. This land was his, except someone else didn't seem to know that. He tied the mare and Clover to a fence post near the porch. The fence itself was in decent shape, which surprised him, and walked slowly toward the house. His boots sounded too loud on the wooden steps. He paused at the door, his hand hovering over the latch. Then he knocked. For a moment there was only silence. Then he heard footsteps inside, quick and light, followed by the sound of a bolt sliding back. The door swung open. A woman stood in the doorway, maybe 50 years old, with short dark hair streaked with silver and eyes the color of flint. She wore jeans, a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, and an expression that was equal parts surprise and suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but Eli could hear the edge in it. "I'm Eli Thorne," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I own this property." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" "Bought it at auction 6 weeks back. Got the papers to prove it." The woman studied him for a moment, then stepped back from the door. "You better come in." Eli hesitated, then stepped inside. The interior of the house was warmer than he'd expected. A fire crackled in a stone fireplace along the far wall. The room was large and open, with exposed beams running across the ceiling. There was a couch, a table with mismatched chairs, a bookshelf filled with worn paperbacks. It smelled like wood smoke and coffee and something baking, and there were 3 other women in the room. One was standing by the fireplace, tall and lean, maybe 55, with long gray hair pulled back in a braid. Another sat at the table, younger than the others, late 40s perhaps, with curly auburn hair and freckles across her nose. The third stood near the kitchen doorway, the oldest of the group, maybe 60, with iron-grey hair cut short and hands that looked strong enough to bend steel. They all stared at him. "This is Eli Thorne," the woman who'd answered the door said. "Says he owns this place." The woman by the fireplace crossed her arms. "That's interesting. So do we." Eli felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded deed, smoothing it against his thigh before holding it up. "I bought this property legally," he said. "I don't know what you were told, but I've got the paperwork." The oldest woman stepped forward, her eyes sharp and assessing. "So do we," she said quietly. "The man who owned this land, Walter Thorne, he was your uncle, wasn't he?" Eli felt something cold slide down his spine. "I haven't seen Walter in 30 years. He died 8 months ago," the woman continued. "Left this place to us. Said we could live here as long as we needed. Gave us each a letter, signed and notarized." Eli's mind raced. Walter Thorne, his mother's brother, a man Eli had met exactly twice in his life. The last time had been at his mother's funeral 3 decades back. Walter had been a hard man, distant and cold, and Eli had avoided him deliberately. "If he left it to you," Eli said slowly, "then why was it auctioned off for back taxes?" The woman by the fireplace uncrossed her arms. "Because he didn't change the deed. He told us it was ours, but he never made it legal. When he died, the county seized it for unpaid taxes." Eli looked around the room, at the 4 women watching him with a mixture of wariness and determination. He thought about the $10 he'd spent, the 3 days he'd traveled, the hope he'd allowed himself to feel. "I don't know what to tell you," he said finally. "I'm sorry about Walter, and I'm sorry if he made you promises he didn't keep. But this land is mine now. I paid for it fair and square." The woman who'd answered the door stepped closer. "We've been here 6 months," she said. "We've kept this place standing. We've repaired the roof, cleared the chimney, fixed the plumbing. We've put our lives into this land, and I respect that," Eli said. "But that doesn't change the facts." The room fell silent. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, Eli could hear Clover braying, a sound both familiar and lonely. The oldest woman finally spoke. "My name is Ruth," she said. "This is Diane," she gestured, to the woman by the fireplace, and Margot, the woman with curly hair. "And you've already met Clara." She nodded at the woman who'd opened the door. "Nice to meet you," Eli said. Though the words felt hollow, Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "It's almost dark," she said. "You've traveled a long way. Why don't you stay the night? Let your animals rest. In the morning, we'll figure out what comes next." Eli wanted to argue, wanted to assert his claim, but he was tired, bone-tired, the kind of tired that came from carrying too much for too long. "All right," he said. "Thank you." Clara nodded toward a door on the far side of the room. "There's a spare room upstairs. Second door on the right. We'll bring your animals into the barn." Eli followed her directions, climbing the creaking stairs to a small room with a single bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the valley. He set his duffel bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under his weight. Through the window, he could see the last light fading from the sky, the hills turning dark against a backdrop of stars just beginning to appear. He thought about the $10 bill he'd spent, now long gone. He thought about Walter Thorne, a man he barely knew, and the promises he'd apparently made. And he thought about the 4 women downstairs, strangers who'd become something more, claimants to a land that might not belong to any of them. Not really. Not yet. Morning came cold and bright. Eli woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, scents so familiar and so foreign at the same time that for a moment he forgot where he was. Then memory rushed back, the house, the 4 women, the impossible situation he'd walked into. He dressed slowly, his joints stiff from the long ride and the unfamiliar mattress, and made his way downstairs. The kitchen was filled with pale sunlight. Clara stood at the stove, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet. Ruth sat at the table with a mug of coffee, reading a newspaper that looked several days old. Diane was nowhere to be seen, but through the window Eli could see her outside, leading Clover toward a water trough. Margot sat at the far end of the table writing in a small notebook. "Coffee's on the counter," Clara said without turning around. "Cups are in the cabinet above." Eli poured himself a cup and sat down at the table, leaving an empty chair between himself and Ruth. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly the way he liked it. "Your donkey's got a stubborn streak," Ruth said, not looking up from her paper. "That's putting it kindly," Eli replied. Ruth smiled, a brief flicker that softened her face. "Diane's good with animals. She'll win him over." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the sizzle of bacon and the ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. Eli felt the strangeness of it all, sitting in a kitchen that was supposedly his, drinking coffee made by a woman he'd just met, while another woman tended to his donkey outside. "We need to talk about this," Eli said finally. Ruth set down her newspaper. "We do." Clara brought plates to the table, bacon, eggs, toast, and sat down. Margot closed her notebook. A moment later, Diane came in from outside, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Your donkey has opinions," she said, sitting down beside Margot. "He comes by it honestly," Eli said. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The food was good, better than anything Eli had cooked for himself in months. When his plate was empty, he set down his fork and looked around the table. "I appreciate the hospitality," he said, "but we can't avoid this. I own this land legally. I have the deed, and we have Walter's letters," Ruth said. "4 of them, 1 for each of us. All saying the same thing. This land was ours, but he never changed the deed," Eli pointed out. "Never filed anything legal. The county took the property for back taxes, and I bought it at auction." Clara leaned forward. "Do you know why we're here, Eli? Do you know what brought 4 women to the middle of nowhere to live in a house that barely had running water when we arrived?" Eli shook his head. "Because we had nowhere else to go," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. "Walter was Diane's uncle. She reached out to him when her husband died and left her with nothing but debt. Walter offered her this place, told her to come, to bring anyone else who needed shelter." Diane nodded. "I knew Ruth from a support group. She'd just lost her daughter to cancer. Spent everything she had on treatments that didn't work. She had 3 weeks before her apartment lease ran out and nowhere to go." Ruth's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Margot continued the story. "I met Clara at a church shelter. I'd left my marriage with nothing but the clothes on my back and my daughter's college fund, which my ex-husband cleaned out before I could stop him. Clara had just been evicted from the room she was renting because the building was sold." Clara picked up the thread. "Walter's letter said we could stay here as long as we needed. He said the land was big enough for all of us, that we could build something together. He said he'd take care of the paperwork, but he didn't," Eli said quietly. "He died before he could," Ruth said. "Heart attack. Sudden. We didn't even know he was gone until the county sent someone to check on the property." Eli looked down at his empty plate. He thought about the $10 he'd spent, about the hope he'd felt when the auctioneer's gavel came down. He thought about the long journey here, about sleeping in his truck and working odd jobs and imagining a quiet place to spend whatever years he had left. "I'm sorry," he said. "I truly am. But I don't have anywhere else to go either. I spent everything I had to get here. So we're at an impasse," Diane said. "Seems that way." Margot spoke up for the first time. Her voice was softer than the others, but there was steel underneath. "There has to be a solution. We've worked too hard to just walk away." "I'm not asking you to walk away," Eli said. "I'm just saying the land is mine, and we're saying it's ours," Clara said. Morally, if not legally, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Eli felt it pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. He'd come here looking for peace, for a place to rest. Instead, he found a fight he didn't want and couldn't avoid. Ruth stood up abruptly. "I need some air." She walked out, the screen door slamming behind her. Through the window, Eli watched her cross the yard and disappear down a path that led toward the creek. "She doesn't show it," Diane said quietly, "but this is killing her. We all lost things to get here, but Ruth lost everything. This place was supposed to be a new start. It was supposed to be that for me, too," Eli said. Clara stood and began clearing the plates. Then maybe we need to figure out how it can be that for all of us. Eli looked at her. What are you suggesting? I don't know yet, Clara admitted. But throwing each other off the land isn't going to solve anything. We'd all end up with nothing, Diane nodded. The property taxes are paid for this year, but they'll come due again. And there's work that needs doing. The barn needs a new roof. The well needs repair. The fences are falling down in places. One person couldn't manage it alone. Neither could 4 people, Margot added. But 5 might. Eli felt something shift in his chest, a loosening he hadn't expected. You're saying we should share the land? I'm saying we should consider it, Clara said, at least until we can figure out a legal solution. Maybe there's a way to challenge the tax sale, or maybe we can buy you out. But in the meantime, we need this place. And it sounds like you do too. Eli thought about it. He'd spent his whole life working land that belonged to other people, taking orders, moving on when the season ended. The idea of owning something, of having a deed with his name on it, that had meant everything to him. It had been the whole point. But sitting in this kitchen, looking at the faces of 4 women who'd fought just as hard as he had to get here, he realized that maybe ownership wasn't the same thing as belonging. Maybe there was a difference between having your name on a piece of paper and having a place that felt like home. I need to think about it, he said. Fair enough, Clara said. But think fast. Winter's coming, and we've got a lot of work to do before the snow falls. Eli stood and walked outside. The air was crisp and clean, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. He could see Ruth down by the creek, standing with her arms wrapped around herself. Clover stood in the corral, watching him with dark, knowing eyes. The land stretched out in all directions, 160 acres of possibility and complication, of hope and heartache. Eli had thought he'd come here to claim something. Now he wasn't sure what he was claiming, or whether it was even his to claim. He walked down to the creek where Ruth stood. I'm not here to fight you, he said quietly. Ruth didn't turn around. Good, because I don't have the energy for it. Clara suggested we might share the land. Work together, I heard. Ruth finally looked at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, tired. Walter was a complicated man. He made promises he couldn't keep, but he meant them. He saw people who needed help, and he tried to help them. That's more than most people do. Did you know he was my uncle? Eli asked. Ruth nodded. He talked about you once. Said he had a nephew who'd spent his life working other people's land. Said you deserved better. Eli felt a lump form in his throat. He never told me that. He never told any of us a lot of things, Ruth said. But maybe he brought us all here for a reason. Maybe the reason is each other. Eli looked out over the water, watching it flow past, constant and unchanging. He thought about all the years he'd spent alone, all the places he'd left behind, all the people he'd said goodbye to. He thought about what it might be like to stay somewhere, to build something with his own hands, to be part of something larger than himself. All right, he said. Let's try. Ruth looked at him, surprised. Just like that? Just like that, Eli said. I'm too old to spend my energy fighting over dirt. And Clara's right. We'll all need each other to make this work. Ruth's shoulders relaxed. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Eli said. We still have to figure out how to live with each other. Ruth almost smiled. One problem at a time. The first week passed in a blur of work and careful negotiation. Eli moved his few belongings into a small bedroom upstairs, the one with the window facing east so he could watch the sun rise over the valley. The women had already established their own spaces, Ruth in the largest bedroom downstairs, Clara in the room next to Eli's, Diane in a converted sunroom off the kitchen, and Margot in a small attic space she'd turned into something between a bedroom and an artist's studio. They divided the work according to ability and preference. Eli took on the heavy repairs, reinforcing the barn's sagging beam structure, clearing brush from around the buildings, fixing the broken gate that led to the upper pasture. Ruth, who'd worked as a bookkeeper before her daughter got sick, took charge of the property's finances and started researching their legal options. Clara, practical and organized, managed the household and coordinated everyone's efforts. Diane handled the animals and started planning a vegetable garden for spring. Margot, who'd taught elementary school for 20 years, threw herself into documenting everything, photographing the property, keeping detailed journals, creating lists of what needed doing. But beneath the cooperative surface, tensions simmered. On the 5th day, Eli was replacing rotted boards on the barn's south wall when Clara approached with a clipboard. "We need to talk about expenses," she said. Eli set down his hammer. "All right, the well pump needs replacing. Ruth got an estimate. It's $1,200. The fence materials you bought yesterday came to $300. We're burning through our savings faster than planned." Eli had exactly $214 left to his name. He'd spent the rest on supplies and the fence materials Clara mentioned. "How much do you all have pooled?" "About 4,000 collectively. But we need that to get through winter. Food, propane, emergency repairs. If we spend it now, we'll have nothing for later. What are you suggesting?" Clara hesitated. "Some of us might need to find work. There's a diner in the town we passed through, about 30 miles south. They had a help-wanted sign. And Ruth heard the county library needs someone part-time." Eli understood what she wasn't saying. "You're worried that if we all leave to work, nothing here will get done. I'm worried we'll lose momentum," Clara said. "We came here to build something, not to spend all our time driving back and forth to pay for it." "Then we prioritize," Eli said. "The well pump is essential. The rest can wait." Clara looked relieved. "I'll tell Ruth." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, a routine that had established itself without discussion, Margot mentioned that she'd found something in the attic. "It was in an old trunk," she said, producing a leather-bound book. "Walter's journal, I think." Ruth took it carefully, opening it to a random page. Her eyes scanned the handwriting, cramped and angular. "It's dated from 2 years ago. Does it say anything about the property?" Diane asked. Ruth flipped through several pages, then stopped. "He talks about you," she said, looking at Diane, "about how you called him after your husband died. He writes she sounded so lost. 'I never had children, never had much family at all. But I have this land, and that's something I can share.'" Diane's eyes glistened. "I barely knew him. We'd met maybe 3 times in my life." Ruth continued reading silently, then looked up. "He talks about all of us. About finding Ruth's name in a grief support group directory after his wife died. About meeting Margot at a church service. About Clara showing up at his door looking for work." She closed the book gently. "He was lonely. That's what this was about. He wanted people here, wanted the land to mean something again." "What about Eli?" Clara asked. "Does he mention him?" Ruth flipped toward the end of the journal. "Here. My sister's boy, Eli, is still out there somewhere, working himself to death on other men's land. I should have done right by him when Sarah died, but I was too wrapped up in my own grief. Too proud. Now I'm old and he probably doesn't even remember me. I'll leave him the property when I go, but the girls need it now. They can work it out after I'm gone. Between the 5 of them, they'll make something good here. I'm sure of it." The table fell silent. Eli felt something twist in his chest. Walter had thought about him, had planned to leave him the property, but he'd also promised it to the women, counting on all of them to somehow figure it out. 5 of us, Margot said softly. "He knew, he hoped," Ruth corrected. "There's a difference." Over the next few days, the journal became a touchstone. Ruth kept it on the kitchen shelf, and various people would pick it up, read passages, try to understand the man who'd brought them all together without quite managing to make it legal. Walter wrote about the land, about years of drought and seasons of plenty, about fixing the barn roof in 98 and losing his wife in 02. He wrote about regrets and small joys, about the creek freezing over every January, and the way the light looked on the hills in September. But he also wrote about his failures, about drinking too much after his wife died, about letting the property slide into disrepair, about the back taxes piling up and his inability to deal with them. He was running from it, Clara said one evening, the journal open in front of her. The money problems. He knew the county was going to take the land, but he couldn't face it. So he promised it to us instead, like that would somehow make it real. "It doesn't change what we're doing here," Diane said. "We're still making it work, are we?" Clara closed the journal. We're burning through money, working ourselves ragged, and we still don't have a legal claim to any of this." Eli, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner repairing a bridle, spoke up. "What would you have us do? Give up and leave?" "No," Clara said. "I just think we need to be realistic. Winter's coming. Things are going to get harder, not easier." She wasn't wrong. As October faded into November, the weather turned. The first frost came early, coating the grass in white crystals that melted by noon. The nights grew longer and colder. They burned through firewood faster than expected, and Eli spent 2 full days cutting and splitting more, his back screaming by the end of each day. The well pump failed on a Tuesday morning. Ruth called the repair service, and they came out that afternoon. A young man with a clipboard who looked around the property with barely concealed skepticism. "This place has been empty a while," he said. "We're fixing that," Ruth told him. The repair cost $1,400, $200 more than the estimate. They pooled what they had, and Eli added his remaining cash. When it was done, they had $1,800 left between all of them, and winter had barely started. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the wind rattle the windows, thinking about numbers and dates and the shrinking distance between what they had and what they needed. He thought about Clara's words, that they needed to be realistic. He thought about the journal, about Walter's hope that 5 people could work it out. He got up and went downstairs. The kitchen was dark, except for the dying embers in the fireplace. Clara sat at the table with a calculator and a stack of papers. Couldn't sleep either. Eli asked, "Too much to think about?" She gestured at the papers. "I'm trying to figure out if there's any way to make this work without someone taking a job in town." Eli poured himself a glass of water and sat down across from her. "What if I went?" Clara looked up. "What?" "I've got experience with ranch work. I could hire on somewhere for the winter, send money back. That defeats the whole purpose," Clara said. "We're supposed to be building something here together." "We are," Eli said. "But building takes money. And right now we don't have enough." Clara studied him in the dim light. "You do that? After fighting so hard to get here?" "I'm not fighting anymore," Eli said. "I'm just trying to make sure we all survive the winter." Clara's expression softened. "Let me think about it. Maybe there's another way." But they both knew there wasn't. The math was simple and unforgiving. The land wanted more than they could give, and winter was coming whether they were ready or not. The decision was made over breakfast 3 days later. They would all look for work, taking shifts so someone was always at the property. Diane found a position at a feed store 2 towns over, 3 days a week. Margot took the library job Ruth had mentioned, working Tuesday through Thursday. Clara convinced the diner to hire her for weekend shifts. Ruth would stay at the ranch, managing things and continuing to research their legal situation. Eli was the last to find work, but it came through an unexpected channel. He'd driven into the nearest town to pick up supplies when he saw a man struggling to load bags of feed into a truck. The man was older, maybe 70, and his movements were stiff with arthritis. "Let me help you with that," Eli said. Together, they loaded the truck. The man introduced himself as Frank Holloway, owner of a cattle ranch 15 miles west of Eli's property. "You're the one who bought the old Thorn place," Frank said. It wasn't a question. Word travels fast. Small county. Not much else to talk about. Frank studied Eli with shrewd eyes. "Heard you got more than you bargained for. That's one way to put it." Frank smiled. "I knew Walter. Good man, terrible with money. He used to work for me sometimes when things got tight for him." He paused, then added, "I could use an extra hand through the winter. Nothing fancy. Mending fences, checking cattle, general maintenance. Pay is fair, and you'd only need to come 3 days a week." Eli felt a weight lift off his chest. "I'll take it. Thought you might." Frank climbed into his truck. "Start Monday, dawn." The work was hard but familiar. Eli fell back into the rhythm of ranch life. The early mornings, the smell of leather and hay, the simple satisfaction of fixing something broken. Frank didn't talk much, which suited Eli fine. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared understanding rather than shared history. On his first paycheck, Eli sent most of the money back to the property with Clara, keeping just enough for gas and emergencies. She tried to argue, but he insisted. "We're in this together," he said. That's what together means. The others did the same. Their paychecks went into a collective fund that Ruth managed with the precision of someone who understood that every dollar mattered. They bought food in bulk, rationed propane, wore extra layers instead of turning up the heat. The winter routine became a kind of meditation. Wake before dawn, work, come home exhausted, eat together, sleep, repeat. But the absences wore on them. With everyone working off the property, the ranch maintenance slowed. Projects that needed doing got postponed. The barn roof still leaked. The fence repair remained half-finished. The garden beds Diane had started sat frozen and forgotten. One evening in mid-December, as they gathered for dinner, Margot said what they were all thinking. "We're surviving, but we're not building anything." "We're building a bank account," Ruth said. "That's something." "It's not what we came here for," Margot insisted. "We came here to create a home, not to work ourselves to death so we could afford to keep a place we're never at." Diane set down her fork. "What are you suggesting? That we quit our jobs and hope the money lasts?" "I'm saying there has to be a better way. If there is, I haven't found it," Ruth said. She sounded tired. They all sounded tired. Eli looked around the table at 4 women who'd become more familiar to him in 2 months than people he'd known for years. He saw the exhaustion in their faces, the worry in their eyes. He thought about Walter's journal, about the man's hope that 5 people could make something work. "What if we're thinking about this wrong?" He said. Everyone looked at him. "We're trying to hold on to the land by working away from it." "But maybe the land itself is the answer," Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "Walter ran cattle here. Frank mentioned it. There's infrastructure, the barn, the fences, the pasture. What if we did the same?" "We don't have money for cattle," Ruth said. "We don't need to buy them," Eli explained. "Frank mentioned something called adjustment. Ranchers pay to graze their cattle on other people's land. We've got 160 acres doing nothing. We could lease grazing rights." Ruth sat up straighter. "How much does that pay?" "Depends on the land quality and the agreement, but it's passive income. The cattle do their thing. We maintain the fences and water sources, and we get paid monthly." Diane leaned forward. "Would Frank be interested?" "I could ask him." The mood around the table shifted, a spark of hope breaking through the exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, they talked late into the night, planning and calculating, imagining possibilities instead of just surviving problems. Frank was interested. He came out to the property the following Saturday, walked the land with Eli, tested the creek water, examined the fences. He didn't say much during the inspection, just made occasional notes in a small book he carried. Finally, back at the house, he gave his assessment. "Land's in decent shape. Creek's reliable. Fences need work, but nothing that can't be fixed." He looked at the 5 of them standing together on the porch. "I'll lease grazing rights for 30 head. $300 a month. 6-month minimum to start." Ruth did the math quickly. "That's $1,800 guaranteed. Enough to cover property taxes and then some," Clara added. Frank nodded. "You'd need to keep the fences maintained and the water sources clear. I'd check the herd once a week, but daily oversight would be on you." "We can do that," Diane said. "I'll draw up a contract," Frank said. Cattle arrive in 2 weeks. After he left, they stood on the porch watching the sun set behind the western hills. The air was cold enough to make their breath visible. But for the first time since they'd started working off the property, Eli felt warm. "This is going to work," Margot said quietly. "Maybe," Ruth cautioned. "If we can get the fences finished in time." "Then we'd better get started," Eli said. They spent the next 2 weeks in a frenzy of activity. Everyone who wasn't working their outside job was working on the ranch. They strung new wire, replaced rotted posts, reinforced weak sections. Eli taught Diane the basics of fence repair, and she proved to be a quick learner, her hands growing calloused but capable. Margot and Clara worked on clearing the water sources, pulling out accumulated debris and making sure the flow was steady. The cattle arrived on a grey morning. 30 red and white Herefords loaded into Frank's trailer. They moved them into the upper pasture, and Eli watched them spread out across the grass. Already settling in. They look right here, Diane said. Standing beside him, they do, Eli agreed. That night, they celebrated with a dinner that felt like a feast, even though it was just stew and bread. The conversation was lighter than it had been in weeks. They talked about the cattle, about the spring garden they'd plant, about fixing up the barn properly once the weather improved. Later, as Eli lay in bed listening to the house settle around him, he thought about how strange it was that 30 head of cattle could change everything. Not just the money they represented, but the sense of purpose they provided. They'd come to the ranch as individuals, each running from something. But taking care of the cattle required them to work as something more. A unit, a team, maybe even a family. Outside, one of the cows lowed softly, a sound that carried through the cold air and made Eli smile. For the first time since he'd arrived, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. January brought snow, and with it, a quiet that settled over the ranch like a blanket. The cattle moved slowly through the white fields, their breath steaming in the cold air. The work became simpler, more routine. Break ice on the water troughs, check fences for damage from the weight of snow, make sure the animals had what they needed. The outside jobs continued, but with the grazing lease money coming in, the pressure eased. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were managing, but winter isolation has a way of bringing things to the surface that stay buried during busier times. It started small. Clara snapped at Diane for leaving dishes in the sink. Diane fired back about Clara's habit of reorganizing shared spaces without asking. Margot retreated more often to her attic room, emerging only for meals and chores. Ruth grew quieter, spending long hours at the kitchen table with Walter's journal and stacks of legal documents. Eli noticed but didn't intervene. He'd learned over the years that people needed space to work through things, that not every problem could be solved by talking it out. But when he came back from Frank's ranch one evening and found Clara sitting alone on the porch in 20-degree weather, he couldn't stay silent. "You'll freeze out here," he said. "I needed air." Her voice was flat. Eli sat down beside her. "What happened?" "Nothing. Everything. I don't know." Clara wrapped her arms around herself. "I thought this would be easier. I thought if we just worked hard enough, things would fall into place." "Things rarely fall into place," Eli said. "Mostly you have to wedge them there and hope they stay put." Clara almost smiled. "That's a depressing way to look at it. It's an honest way." They sat in silence for a moment. A cow lowed somewhere in the darkness. Inside, yellow light glowed in the kitchen windows. "I spent 15 years in a marriage where nothing I did was good enough," Clara said suddenly. "No matter how hard I tried, how much I organized, how perfect I made things, it was never enough. When I left, I swore I'd never let anyone make me feel that way again. Has someone here made you feel that way?" "No, that's what scares me." Clara looked at him. "I'm doing it to myself. Trying to control everything, fix everything, make everything perfect so we don't fail. And I'm exhausting everyone in the process. You're exhausting yourself too, I know." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You'd think at 53 I'd have learned by now. Learning and doing are different things," Eli said. "I know I should slow down, that my back can't take the work it used to. Doesn't stop me from trying." Clara studied him in the dim light from the house. "What brought you here, Eli?" "Really? I told you. I bought the property. I mean before that. What were you running from?" Eli was quiet for a long time. The cold seeped through his coat, but he didn't move. "I wasn't running from anything. I just didn't have anywhere to run to. That's not the same as having somewhere to stay." "No," Eli agreed. "It's not." He thought about all the places he'd been, all the temporary arrangements that had defined his life. Bunkhouses and borrowed rooms, trailers and truck beds, spaces he occupied but never owned. He thought about watching other men build lives while he built their fences. Watching families gather around tables in houses he'd never enter except to fix a door or repair a roof. "I was tired," he said finally. "Tired of moving, tired of being temporary. I wanted to stop somewhere. Didn't much matter where. And now?" Clara asked. "Now I'm not so sure I wanted to stop alone." Clara nodded slowly. "Walter knew that, I think. That's why he brought all of us here. Not just because we needed the land, but because we needed each other. Maybe. Have you thought about what happens if Ruth finds a way to overturn the sale? If the property legally becomes ours instead of yours? Eli had thought about it. He'd thought about it more than he wanted to admit. I'd cross that bridge when I come to it. Would you leave? No. The answer came faster than he expected. No, I don't think I would. Clara smiled, a real smile this time. Good, because we'd have to tie Clover across the driveway to keep you here. And that seems unkind to the donkey. They went inside together, back into the warm house where the others were gathered around the fireplace. Nobody asked where they'd been, but Diane scooted over on the couch to make room, and Margot poured them both coffee without being asked. But the tension didn't disappear. It just changed shape. Ruth's research hit a dead end. She'd consulted with 3 lawyers, each of whom said the same thing. The tax sale was legal. Walter's letters weren't legally binding, and their best option was to negotiate with Eli for shared ownership or a lease agreement. The problem was that formalizing such an arrangement required legal fees none of them could afford. We're stuck in limbo, Ruth said one evening, spreading papers across the kitchen table. Eli owns the land legally, but morally it belongs to all of us. We can't move forward without a clear agreement, but we can't afford to make a clear agreement. What about a handshake deal? Diane suggested. We trust each other, don't we? Trust doesn't hold up in court, Ruth said. If something happens to one of us, or if someone decides to leave, or if... She stopped, not finishing the sentence. If I decide to sell, Eli finished for her. I wasn't going to say that, but you were thinking it. Eli wasn't angry. He understood the fear underneath the words. I get it. I'm the only one with legal claim. That puts all of you at risk, so what do we do? Margot asked. Nobody had an answer. The problem festered. Small disagreements became bigger ones. Diane and Clara's argument about the dishes escalated into a fight about responsibilities and contributions. Margot withdrew further, spending entire days in her attic room, coming down only when called for meals. Ruth grew sharp and brittle, snapping at questions and avoiding conversations. Eli found himself caught in the middle, trying to maintain peace while knowing he was the source of the underlying tension. His legal ownership was the wedge dividing them, even as they tried to pretend it didn't matter. One night, he couldn't sleep. He went down to the barn, where Clover was bedded down in fresh hay. The donkey looked up, chewing slowly. We're making a mess of this, Eli told him. Clover just blinked. Walter thought 5 people could work it out. But maybe he was wrong. Maybe some things can't be worked out, no matter how much you want them to. He sat down on a hay bale, his breath visible in the cold barn air. Through the open door, he could see the house, light glowing in the downstairs windows. 5 people living under one roof, trying to build something none of them quite knew how to build. Trying to create family from strangers, home from contested ground. Walter's journal talked about legacy, about making the land mean something. But legacy required permanence, and permanence required trust. And trust required something they didn't have, the security of knowing tomorrow would look like today, that the ground beneath their feet wouldn't shift without warning. Eli thought about the $10 bill he'd spent months ago. Such a small thing to cause such complicated problems. But maybe that was the nature of hope. It didn't come with guarantees or easy answers. It just came with the possibility that something better might exist if you were brave enough to reach for it. He stayed in the barn until his fingers grew numb with cold, then walked back to the house. Inside, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with her papers, still searching for an answer that might not exist. Any luck? Eli asked. Ruth shook her head. I'm starting to think we need a different approach, such as, I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. She looked up at him, tired but determined. We've all come too far to give up now. Eli nodded. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that determination could overcome legal complications and financial limitations and the fundamental uncertainty of their situation. But wanting something and having it were different things. And winter was long, and the space between them felt wider than it had in months. February arrived with a thaw that turned the snow to mud and made everything twice as difficult. The cattle trudged through the muck, their hooves leaving deep impressions that filled with standing water. The road to the main highway became nearly impassable, which meant everyone had to leave earlier for their outside jobs and come home later, exhausted and covered in mud. The tension in the house reached a breaking point on a Sunday afternoon. Margot had been in town for her library shift and came back with groceries. As she unpacked them, Clara noticed the total on the receipt. "You spent $200, Clara said, her voice tight. "We needed food," Margot replied. "We needed food at reasonable prices. There's a discount store 20 miles south. This is the expensive market." Margot set down a bag harder than necessary. "I'm not driving an extra 40 miles round trip to save $15. $15 adds up," Clara said. "We're on a budget. I know we're on a budget. I help make the budget. But I also work 3 days a week and do my share around here, and I'm not going to apologize for buying groceries at a store that's actually on my way home." Ruth intervened. Clara let it go. "We're fine on money this month." "This month," Clara said. "But what about next month? What about when the lease money runs out, or Frank decides he doesn't need the pasture anymore?" "Then we'll figure it out," Diane said from the doorway. "Like we always do?" "That's not a plan," Clara said. "That's hope. Hope isn't enough. Then what is?" Margot's voice rose. "What's your plan, Clara? Because all I see you doing is counting every penny and criticizing everyone else's choices." The room went silent. Clara's face flushed. "I'm trying to keep us from losing everything." "No," Margot said quietly. "You're trying to control everything. There's a difference." Clara turned and walked out. They heard her boots on the stairs, then the slam of her bedroom door. Eli, who'd been in the living room pretending not to hear, came into the kitchen. "That was harsh." "It was true," Margot said, but she looked shaken. "Truth can be harsh," Ruth said. "Doesn't make it easier to hear." That night nobody ate together. Clara stayed in her room. Margot took her dinner to the attic. Diane made a sandwich and went to check on the cattle. Ruth heated soup and sat alone at the table, reading Walter's journal for what must have been the 20th time. Eli made his way upstairs and knocked on Clara's door. "Go away," she said. "No." After a moment the door opened. Clara's eyes were red. "What do you want?" "To make sure you're all right." "I'm fine." "You're not." Eli leaned against the doorframe. "And that's okay. None of us are fine. We're all just pretending at different volumes." Clara almost laughed. "That's a strange way to put it, but accurate." She stepped back, letting him into the small room. It was neat as always, the bed made with hospital corners, her few belongings organized with military precision. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and Eli took the only chair. "I'm not controlling," Clara said after a moment. "I'm just trying to help." "I know. So why does it feel like I'm failing?" Eli thought about that. "Because you're measuring success by an impossible standard. You can't control everything, Clara. You can't prevent every problem or plan for every contingency. Sometimes you just have to trust that things will work out, and if they don't, then we deal with it together." Clara looked at him, her expression raw. "What if I don't know how to do that? What if I've spent so long trying to do everything myself that I don't know how to let other people help?" "Then you learn," Eli said. "Same as the rest of us." They sat in silence for a while. Through the window, Eli could see the barn, dark against the evening sky. He thought about all the times he'd tried to do everything himself, all the years he'd spent isolated by choice and circumstance. He thought about how hard it was to let people in, to trust that they'd stay, to believe that cooperation wasn't the same as weakness. "I'll apologize to Margot," Clara said finally. "That's a start." But the next morning brought a different kind of problem. Eli was checking the cattle when he found one of the Herefords lying in the mud, struggling to stand. Her breathing was labored, and when he got closer, he could see blood on her hindquarters. He ran back to the barn and called Frank. "Sounds like she's trying to calve," Frank said. "Shouldn't be. I didn't bring any pregnant cows to your place? Well, something's wrong with her. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Meanwhile, get her into the barn if you can. She needs to be out of the mud." Eli got Diane, and together they managed to coax the struggling cow into the barn. She was young, maybe 3 years old, and clearly in distress. By the time Frank arrived with the vet, the cow was lying on her side, her breathing rapid and shallow. The vet worked quickly, examining the cow with practiced efficiency. Finally, she stood up and pulled off her gloves. "She's been bred," the vet said to Frank, "and she's having complications. I can try to save the calf, but it's risky for both of them." "Do what you can," Frank said. They all stood back while the vet worked. Diane held Eli's arm, her grip tight. Clara, Ruth, and Margot had come down from the house and stood in the barn doorway watching. It took an hour of tense silence, broken only by the vet's quiet instructions and the cow's labored breathing. When it was finally over, there were 2 calves lying in the hay, twins, small and wet and perfect. "Twins," the vet said, sounding surprised. "That explains the complications. The mother cow was exhausted but alive." She lifted her head, looking at her calves with what Eli could have sworn was bewilderment. Frank came over to where Eli stood. "I didn't know she was bred. The trader I bought her from didn't say anything. She's yours now. I won't take her back with calves." "Frank, I can't." "You can and you will," Frank said firmly. "You and your people saved her life. The calves, too. That counts for something." After Frank and the vet left, the 5 of them stood in the barn, looking at the 3 animals, mother and twins, all breathing steadily now. "We have cattle," Diane said wonderingly. 3 of them, Margot added. Ruth was calculating in her head. "If we raise them right, we could sell the calves in a year, or keep them and start our own herd." "Our herd," Clara said quietly. "Not just cattle we're watching for someone else, ours." They stood there for a long time, watching the calves learn to stand on shaky legs, watching their mother nuzzle them with an exhausted tenderness that needed no translation. Eli felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't ownership he felt looking at those animals. It was responsibility, purpose, the understanding that they'd been given something to care for, something that depended on them completely. Later that night, Clara knocked on Margot's door. Eli heard them talking, heard Clara's apology and Margot's acceptance. He heard them laugh about something, the sound carrying through the old house like a promise. Outside in the barn, 3 cows slept in the hay. 3 living things that hadn't existed yesterday, that required them to be better than they'd been, to work together instead of separately. Walter had written about legacy, about making the land mean something. Maybe this was what he'd meant. Not grand gestures or perfect plans, but small moments that added up to something larger. 3 cows in a barn, 5 people learning to trust each other. A place that was becoming, slowly and imperfectly, a home. Spring came late that year, arriving not with warmth but with rain that turned everything to mud and made the creek run high and fast. The calves grew strong, following their mother around the pasture with the awkward enthusiasm of youth. The outside work continued, but there was a new ease to it now. A sense that they'd survived the worst of winter and come out intact. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early April, a car pulled up the long driveway. Ruth was at the kitchen window when she saw it, a silver sedan moving slowly over the rutted road. She called out to the others, and they gathered on the porch as the car came to a stop. A woman emerged, maybe 40 years old, wearing business casual clothes that looked out of place against the muddy backdrop of the ranch. "Can we help you?" Ruth called out. The woman approached with a folder tucked under her arm. "I'm looking for the residents of this property. My name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm an attorney from Billings." Eli's stomach dropped. "An attorney rarely brought good news." "We're all here," Ruth said, gesturing to the 5 of them. "What's this about?" Jennifer climbed the porch steps carefully, avoiding the worst of the mud. "It's about Walter Thorne's estate." "May we talk inside?" They gathered around the kitchen table, coffee poured but untouched. Jennifer spread papers from her folder across the worn wood surface. "I apologize for not reaching out sooner," she began. "Walter Thorne was my client for many years, but he was very specific about the timing of certain information. He left instructions that I was only to contact you after the property had been sold for back taxes and after the new owner had taken possession." "Why would he do that?" Diane asked. Jennifer looked at each of them in turn. "Because Walter Thorne was a complicated man who believed in testing people. He wanted to see what would happen when you all met, whether you'd fight or find a way to cooperate." The table went silent. Eli felt anger rising in his chest. He set us up, in a manner of speaking. Jennifer pulled out a document. Walter knew the property would be seized for back taxes. He'd been in correspondence with the county for months. He also knew that by not officially changing the deed, any promises he made to you, she gestured to the four women, wouldn't be legally binding. So he lied to us, Clara said flatly. No, he gave you exactly what he promised, a place to live, for as long as you needed it. He just didn't guarantee it in the way you expected. Ruth leaned forward. What are you saying? Jennifer pulled out another document, this one notarized and official-looking. Walter established a trust fund, $20,000, to be released to the 5 people living on this property 6 months after the sale, provided they were still living here together and working cooperatively to maintain the land. The room erupted. Everyone spoke at once, questions, overlapping questions. Jennifer raised her hand for silence. There's more. Walter left a letter to be read by all of you together. May I? She pulled out an envelope, worn and sealed with wax. Ruth took it with trembling hands, broke the seal, and unfolded several pages of handwriting they all recognized from the journal. Ruth read aloud, her voice shaking slightly. To Eli, Diane, Clara, Margot, and Ruth, if you're reading this, then you've made it 6 months together. That's longer than I expected, to be honest. You're probably angry with me, and you have every right to be. I've played games with your lives, with your hopes, and that's not something a good man does. But I never claimed to be a good man. I claimed to be a practical one. The truth is, I was dying when I wrote this. Cancer, if you must know. The doctors gave me 6 months, and they were right on the money. I spent those 6 months watching 4 women arrive at my property, each broken in her own way, each looking for something she'd lost. I wanted to help. I wanted to give you this land. But I knew that giving you something outright wouldn't teach you what you needed to learn. You needed to learn how to fight for something, how to work together, how to build trust from nothing but shared necessity. If I'd just handed you the deed, you'd have taken it and maybe stuck around, maybe not. But you wouldn't have learned what it means to truly own something, to earn it with sweat and compromise and determination. Eli, I didn't know if you'd show up. You were the wild card in all this, but I hoped you would. I hoped the nephew I barely knew would find his way here, and that somehow 5 strangers could become something more. The $20,000 is yours, collectively. Use it to formalize whatever arrangement you've worked out. Buy out Eli's claim and split the deed 5 ways. Or give it all to Eli in exchange for permanent residence rights. Or come up with some third option I haven't thought of. The point is, you've earned the right to decide together, and if you've made it 6 months, if you're still there reading this, then you've already built something more valuable than any deed or dollar amount. You've built a family. Not the family you were born into, but the family you chose. That's worth more than all the land in Montana. I'm sorry I couldn't be more honest with you while I was alive. I'm sorry for the confusion and the hardship. But I'm not sorry for bringing you together. That's the one thing I did right. Take care of each other. Take care of the land. It'll take care of you in return, Walter. The silence that followed was absolute. Eli stared at the letter, at Walter's handwriting, trying to process what he'd just heard. It had all been a test, a manipulation, a dying man's attempt to force 5 strangers into becoming something he'd never managed himself, connected. That son of a... Clara started. Don't, Ruth interrupted. Don't finish that sentence. Why not? He played us, all of us. He gave us a chance, Diane said quietly. That's more than most people get. Margot was crying, tears streaming down her face. He was right, though. We did build something. We did become a family. Eli stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need air. He walked out onto the porch, down the steps, across the muddy yard to the fence where the cattle grazed. His hands gripped the top rail so hard his knuckles went white. Behind him, he heard the screen door open and close. Heard footsteps in the mud. Eli, it was Ruth. Talk to me. I don't know what to say. Neither do I. She stood beside him, looking out at the land. He knew you'd come. Somehow he knew. He didn't know anything about me. Maybe not. But he knew people. He knew what they needed, even if they didn't know it themselves. Eli thought about the auction, about the $10 bid that had changed everything. The whole thing was staged. The county probably would have let the property go for taxes anyway, but Walter made sure. Made sure there'd be something I could afford. Something that would get me here. Does that change what you feel about this place? Eli didn't answer immediately. He watched the cows grazing, watched the wind move through the grass, watched the creek sparkle in the afternoon light. He thought about the last 6 months, the work, the arguments, the slow building of trust and understanding. He thought about Clara's need for control, Ruth's quiet strength, Diane's gentle wisdom, Margot's creative spirit. He thought about how they'd all driven each other crazy, and how they'd all saved each other in ways big and small. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't change anything. Then we move forward. How?" Ruth smiled. With $20,000 and a decision to make, they went back inside together. Jennifer was still at the table, waiting patiently. The others looked up when Eli and Ruth entered. "I'm angry," Eli said without preamble. "I'm angry that Walter manipulated us, but I'm also grateful. If he hadn't, I wouldn't be here. None of us would be. So what do we do with the money?" Diane asked. They looked at each other, 5 people who'd started as strangers and become something more through shared hardship and unexpected grace. "We split the deed 5 ways, Clara said. "Equal shares, equal ownership. That's what I was going to suggest," Margot added. Ruth nodded. "All in favor?" 5 hands went up. Jennifer smiled. "I'll draw up the paperwork. It'll take a few weeks, but we can make this legal and binding." She gathered her papers, preparing to leave. "For what it's worth, Walter would be proud. He bet on all of you, and you proved him right." After she left, they sat around the table in stunned silence. $20,000. Equal ownership. A future that suddenly felt more solid than it had since any of them arrived. "We should celebrate," Margot said. "With what?" Clara asked, but she was smiling. "With hope," Diane said. "It's free, and we've got plenty of it." They laughed then, the sound filling the kitchen like sunlight after a long winter. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the clouds were breaking apart to reveal patches of blue sky. Walter's test was over. But the real work, the work of building a life together, of maintaining trust, of creating something lasting from the broken pieces they'd all brought with them, that work was just beginning. The weeks following Jennifer's visit were a strange mix of elation and uncertainty. They had the promise of shared ownership, the security of knowing the land would belong to all of them equally. But the paperwork took time, and in that waiting period, old anxieties resurfaced alongside new possibilities. They decided, collectively, to use part of the $20,000 to quit their outside jobs and focus entirely on the ranch. It was a risk, but with the grazing lease, the growing herd, and plans to expand, they believed they could make the land support them. "We'll need to diversify," Ruth said one evening, spreading papers across the kitchen table. She'd drawn up a business plan, something formal enough to present to a bank if they needed a loan. "The cattle are good, but we need multiple income streams. Vegetables we can sell at farmers' markets. Maybe chickens for eggs. Tourism," Margot suggested. "Agritourism is big. People pay to stay on working ranches, to experience rural life." Diane looked skeptical. "We'd need to fix up the place first. Build guest accommodations, which we could do with the trust money," Clara pointed out. "Invest in the infrastructure, market ourselves, build slowly." They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming. It felt different from the survival planning of winter, less desperate, more hopeful. But with hope came pressure. They were no longer just trying to hang on. They were trying to build something sustainable, something that would last. Eli threw himself into the physical work. He repaired the barn roof, finally addressing the leak that had plagued them all winter. He rebuilt sections of fence, strengthening the perimeter. He worked with Diane to expand the garden, breaking new ground, and amending the soil with composted manure from the barn. But at night, doubts crept in. He'd spent 40 years as a hired hand, never responsible for anything beyond his assigned tasks. Now he was part owner of a business venture, one of 5 people betting their futures on land and livestock and ideas that might or might not work. One evening, Frank stopped by to check on his cattle. He found Eli in the barn, building stalls for the new calves. "You're putting in serious work," Frank observed. "Got to earn my keep." Frank studied him for a moment. "You worried about something?" Eli set down his hammer. "What if we fail? What if we pour everything into this place and it doesn't work out?" "Then you fail," Frank said simply. "But you fail trying, which is better than failing because you never tried at all. Is that supposed to be comforting?" Frank smiled. "It's supposed to be honest. You want comfort, go to church. You want the truth, talk to someone who's been where you are. Have you been here? Different circumstances, same fear. When I bought my place 40 years back, everyone said I was crazy. Land was marginal, drought-prone, too far from town. I spent the first 5 years convinced they were right, that I'd made a terrible mistake. What changed? Nothing changed. I just stopped waiting for permission to succeed, stopped looking for guarantees that didn't exist." Frank picked up a piece of wood, examined it, set it down. "You've got something here, Eli. You've got people willing to work beside you, land that's good enough if you treat it right, and just enough money to make it interesting. That's more than most folks start with." After Frank left, Eli stood in the barn doorway watching the sun set behind the western hills. The sky turned orange, then pink, then deep purple. Stars began appearing one by one, like promises being kept. Inside the house, lights came on. He could see shadows moving past the windows, his housemates, his partners, the closest thing to family he'd had in decades. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, but it was a weight he chose to carry. That made all the difference. The paperwork for the deed arrived on a Monday morning. Jennifer drove out personally to oversee the signing. They gathered around the kitchen table, each in turn putting pen to paper, witnessing each other's signatures, making it official. When it was done, Jennifer handed them each a copy of the new deed. 5 names listed as equal owners of 160 acres in Hays County, Montana. "Congratulations," Jennifer said. "You're now officially business partners and property owners." After she left, they stood on the porch holding their copies of the deed. These pieces of paper that represented so much more than legal ownership. They represented months of work, of conflict and compromise, of learning to trust and be trusted. "We should frame these," Margot said. "We should celebrate," Diane countered. They did both. That evening, they drove into town and had dinner at the diner where Clara used to work. The owner, a woman named Betty who'd always been kind to Clara, insisted their meal was on the house. "Heard you all made something work out there," Betty said, refilling their coffee. "That takes guts." It took more than guts, Eli thought. It took luck and timing and Walter's strange manipulations. It took 5 people willing to show up and stay, even when staying was hard. But he just smiled and thanked Betty for the meal. They drove home under a full moon, the truck bouncing over the rutted road, everyone tired but happy in a way that felt earned. When they pulled up to the house, Eli saw it with fresh eyes, not as a building he'd bought for $10, but as a home he'd helped create through months of hard work and harder conversations. That night, Eli took Walter's journal from the kitchen shelf and carried it to his room. He'd read portions of it before, but never the whole thing. Now he read it cover to cover, starting with entries from 10 years ago and working forward to the final pages written just weeks before Walter's death. The journal painted a picture of a man wrestling with loneliness and regret. Walter wrote about his wife, about how her death had hollowed him out. He wrote about the land, about seasons and weather and the small satisfactions of ranch life. And toward the end, he wrote about the decision to bring people to the property, to try to create something meaningful from the mess he'd made of his finances and his life. One entry, dated just 3 weeks before Walter died, stopped Eli cold. "I saw Eli's name in the county records today. He's working at the Morrison place 70 miles from here. So close, but he doesn't know I exist. Or if he does, he doesn't care. I can't blame him. I was a poor uncle too wrapped up in my own grief to notice anyone else's, but I want to do right by him now. I want to give him something that matters. Not just land, but the chance to belong somewhere. To people. I hope he takes it. I hope they all take it. Eli closed the journal and sat in the darkness, staring out the window at the moonlit valley. Walter had somehow known that Eli needed this place, these people, this impossible situation. Had counted on Eli showing up to the auction, bidding on property nobody else wanted, walking into a house full of strangers and choosing to stay. It should have made Eli angry, this manipulation from beyond the grave. Instead, he felt grateful. Walter had seen something in him that Eli hadn't seen in himself, the capacity to be part of something larger, to build instead of just maintain, to plant roots instead of staying perpetually ready to move. The next morning, Eli woke early and went down to the barn. The mother cow and her twins were there, the calves growing fast, already showing the sturdy build they'd inherited from their mother. He stood watching them for a long time, thinking about growth and investment, about how you had to commit to something before you could see what it would become. When he came back to the house, the others were already up. Ruth was making coffee. Clara was reviewing the business plan. Diane was outside checking the fence line. Margot was at the table writing in her journal, documenting their journey the way Walter had documented his. "We need to name the ranch," Margot said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. "We can't just keep calling it the property or Walter's place. It needs a name, something that represents what we're building." They spent the next hour suggesting names, debating options, laughing at the terrible ones and seriously considering the good ones. Finally, Ruth spoke up. "5 Corners," she said, "because there are 5 of us, and we came from 5 different directions, and we met here at the center of something we're building together." The table went quiet. Then one by one they nodded. 5 Corners Ranch, Eli said, testing the words. They felt right. 5 Corners Ranch, the others echoed. They spent the rest of the morning working on a sign. Eli cut a piece of wood from a fallen tree and sanded it smooth. Margot painted the letters, her hand steady and sure. When it was done, they carried it to the front gate and mounted it on the posts Eli had set in concrete the week before. The sign read, 5 Corners Ranch. Below it, in smaller letters, Est 2025, they stood back and looked at it. 5 people who'd become partners, strangers who'd become family, individuals who'd become something stronger together than they'd ever been apart. "This is real now," Clara said quietly. "It was always real," Ruth corrected. "Now it just has a name, but naming something changed it, made it official, made it permanent in a way that verbal agreements and handshakes couldn't. The sign stood at the gate like a declaration. This is ours. This is us. This is where we belong." As they walked back to the house, Eli felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, which was too fragile a word for what he felt. Security, purpose, the bone-deep knowledge that he'd found what he'd been looking for without quite knowing he was looking for it. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun set, drinking coffee and watching the cattle graze in the lower pasture. The sign at the gate caught the last of the light, the painted letters glowing like a promise. "We did it," Diane said. "We actually did it. We're not done yet," Ruth said. "This is just the beginning, but beginnings mattered. They mattered more than most people realized, because beginnings determined direction, set the tone, established the foundation that everything else would be built on. And this beginning, 5 people, 1 ranch, a shared vision, felt solid enough to last. The challenge came in May, just as they were settling into their new reality as official co-owners of 5 Corners Ranch. A developer named Marcus Brennan showed up unannounced on a Thursday morning, driving a spotless SUV that looked absurdly out of place on the muddy ranch road. He was maybe 50, dressed in expensive casual wear, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. Eli was in the garden with Diane when the SUV pulled up. They walked over to meet him, joined quickly by the others who'd heard the vehicle approach. "Can we help you?" Ruth asked, her voice polite but wary. Brennan smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm here to make you an offer. Marcus Brennan, Brennan Development Group out of Billings. He handed Ruth a business card. I represent a consortium interested in acquiring property in this area. We're prepared to offer you $400,000 for this land. The number hung in the air like a challenge. $400,000. More money than any of them had seen in their lives. The property isn't for sale, Clara said firmly. Brennan's smile didn't waver. Everything's for sale at the right price. $400,000 split 5 ways. That's $80,000 each. You could buy better land somewhere else. Land that doesn't require this much work. We're not interested, Eli said. Don't be hasty. Brennan pulled out a folder. Let me explain what we're offering. Full market value, no contingencies, cash sale. We close in 30 days. You walk away with money in your pockets and no more worries about wells and fences and property taxes. Ruth took the folder, but didn't open it. What do you want the land for? Development. We're planning a luxury residential community. Vacation homes for people from the city who want a taste of ranch life without the work. Diane's expression hardened. You want to turn this into a subdivision. A carefully planned community, Brennan corrected. Preserving the natural beauty while providing modern amenities. It's progress. It's destruction, Margot said. You'd bulldoze everything that makes this place special. Brennan shrugged. That's a matter of perspective. Look, I understand you've put effort into this property. That's admirable. But be realistic. You're 5 people trying to run a ranch with no experience and limited capital. The odds of success aren't in your favor. Take the money. Make smart decisions. Eli felt anger rising in his chest, but before he could speak, Ruth stepped forward. Mr. Brennan, I appreciate your offer, but we're not interested. This land isn't just property to us. It's our home. It's where we've built something that matters more than money. I'm sorry you feel that way, Brennan said, his tone suggesting he wasn't sorry at all. But I'll leave my card. When reality sets in, when the next crisis hits and you realize you're in over your heads, call me. The offer stands for 60 days. He got back in his SUV and drove away, leaving them standing in a cluster, watching the dust settle on the road. $400,000, Margot said quietly. Don't, Clara warned. I'm not saying we should take it. I'm just saying it's a lot of money. It's blood money, Diane said. He'd destroy this place. Turn it into something plastic and fake. Ruth opened the folder Brennan had left. Inside were property comparisons, financial projections, glossy renderings of what the luxury residential community would look like, houses that all looked the same, perfectly manicured lawns, nothing that resembled the wild beauty of the land as it existed. He's done his research, Ruth said. He knows our financial situation, knows we're running on hope and cattle lease payments. He's betting we'll fold. Then we prove him wrong, Eli said. But that night, lying in bed, Eli couldn't stop thinking about the number. $80,000. He could buy a small place somewhere, live simply, not have to worry about fences and wells and whether the ranch would survive another winter. He could go back to being alone, which was simpler even if it was lonelier. He heard footsteps on the stairs and looked out to see Clara, standing on the porch. He went down to join her. Couldn't sleep, he asked, thinking about the offer. Me too. They stood in comfortable silence, looking out at the dark land. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. It's tempting, Clara admitted. Not because I want to leave, but because I'm scared of what happens if we stay and fail. Fear's a poor reason to make decisions, Eli said. Is it? Or is it wisdom disguised as cowardice? Eli thought about that. I spent 40 years making decisions based on fear. Fear of commitment, fear of failure, fear of depending on anyone. It kept me safe, but it kept me alone. I don't want to be alone anymore. Clara looked at him. Neither do I. Then we stay, we fight. We make this work. All of us. All of us. Inside the house, a light came on in the kitchen. Through the window, they could see Ruth sitting at the table with Walter's journal. Diane came downstairs and joined her. Margot appeared from the attic, drawn by the gathering. Looks like we're not the only ones thinking, Clara said. They went inside. The 5 of them sat around the table, the journal open between them, Brennan's folder pushed to the side. We need to decide this together, Ruth said. All of us. No one person gets to make this choice. I say we tell him to go to hell, Diane said. Seconded, Margot added. Clara nodded. I agree. They all looked at Eli. I bought this place for $10, he said. Best money I ever spent. I'm not selling it for 400,000 or 4 million. This is where I belong, Ruth smiled. Then it's unanimous. They called Brennan the next morning. Ruth made the call while the others listened, her voice steady and clear. Mr. Brennan, this is Ruth from Five Corners Ranch. We've discussed your offer and our answer is no. Please don't contact us again. There was a pause. Then Brennan's voice came through the speakerphone. You're making a mistake. Maybe, Ruth said. But it's our mistake to make. She hung up before he could respond. But Brennan didn't give up easily. Over the next 2 weeks he came back twice more, each time increasing his offer. $450, $500, finally $550,000, over $100,000 each. Each time they said no. He's desperate, Clara observed after the third visit. Why? Ruth had been wondering the same thing. She spent an afternoon at the county records office and came back with information that explained everything. Brennan's already bought up the surrounding properties, she told the others. 7 parcels all around us. We're the keystone piece. Without our land, his development doesn't work. The access road has to come through our property, and the water rights he needs are tied to our creek. So we have leverage, Diane said. We have something better, Eli said. We have what he wants, and he can't force us to sell, but they underestimated Brennan's determination. A week later, a county inspector showed up, clipboard in hand, citing violations. The barn needed electrical upgrades. The well didn't meet current safety standards. The septic system was non-compliant. Each violation came with a fine and a deadline for correction. This is Brennan, Ruth said, reading through the citations. He's using the county to pressure us. The cost of bringing everything up to code would be nearly $30,000, more than they had left after investing in the ranch improvements. They sat around the table, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. We could take out a loan, Margot suggested. Banks don't loan to start-up ranches with no track record, Ruth said. She'd already called 3 banks. None were interested. We could sell some of the cattle, Diane offered. We need them for next year's breeding, Eli countered. Selling now would set us back years. Clara looked at the folder Brennan had left, still sitting on the corner of the table like a temptation. Or we could sell. No, Eli said firmly. I'm not saying I want to. I'm saying it might be our only option. The argument that followed was the worst they'd had since those early winter months. Voices were raised. Old fears surfaced. Clara accused Eli of being stubborn. Eli accused Clara of giving up. Ruth tried to mediate. Diane and Margot took sides. The kitchen felt too small for all the anger and fear and frustration. Finally, Ruth stood up. Stop. All of you, just stop. The room went quiet. This is exactly what Brennan wants, Ruth continued. He wants us fighting each other instead of fighting him. He wants us so exhausted and divided that selling seems like relief. So what do? Margot asked, her voice small. Ruth looked at each of them in turn. We remember why we're here. Not for the land itself, but for what it represents. A place where we belong. A future we built together. Walter brought us here because he believed we were strong enough to fight for something that mattered. So we fight. With what money? Clara asked, but her anger had faded. With creativity. With determination. With each other. Ruth pulled out a blank piece of paper. Let's brainstorm. What resources do we have that we haven't used yet? They talked through the night, ideas flowing and evolving. By dawn, they had a plan. Frank agreed to hire them as contract labor, fence repair, branding help, any work he had. Paid weekly, enough to start building their repair fund. Betty at the diner agreed to buy vegetables from their garden, paying cash up front for a guaranteed supply. Through the season, Margot reached out to her old teaching contacts and arranged to lead nature education programs on the ranch, school groups who'd pay to learn about sustainable agriculture and ranch life. Diane negotiated with the feed store to trade labor for materials, working off their debt one shift at a time. Clara used her organizational skills to create a crowdfunding campaign. telling their story honestly. 5 people trying to preserve a ranch from developers who wanted to destroy it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People donated money, yes, but also materials, expertise, and their own labor. Within 3 weeks, they had what they needed. Not from one big solution, but from dozens of small ones. The community rallied around them in ways they hadn't expected. People who valued what 5 Corners represented. Real people doing real work, building something authentic in a world of plastic developments and manufactured experiences. The county inspector came back, grudgingly signed off on the repairs, and left looking disappointed that his citations hadn't broken them. Brennan came by one final time, his expression cold. "You won this round, but ranching is hard. You'll fail eventually, and when you do, don't bother calling me." "The offer's off the table." "Good," Eli said. "We wouldn't take it anyway." After Brennan left, they stood on the porch watching his SUV disappear down the road. The relief was palpable, mixed with exhaustion and pride. "We did it," Diane said, her voice filled with wonder. "We survived," Ruth corrected. "Now we thrive." The sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. The cattle grazed peacefully. The garden showed rows of green shoots pushing through the soil. The sign at the gate, 5 Corners Ranch, stood solid and proud. They'd fought for their home and won. Not with money or lawyers, but with determination and community and the simple refusal to give up on something that mattered. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Summer arrived in full force, bringing long days of work and longer evenings of satisfaction. The garden flourished under Diane's careful attention, producing more vegetables than they could eat. They sold the surplus at the farmer's market 2 towns over, Clara managing the booth with the efficiency she'd once applied to controlling everything and now channeled into building something sustainable. The cattle thrived. The twins grew strong and healthy, and in July, 2 more of Frank's cows calved on their property. Frank, gruff as ever, simply shrugged and said the calves were theirs to keep. By August, they had a herd of 9. Margot's education programs brought school groups to the ranch twice a week through the spring and early summer. Children from town spent afternoons learning about sustainable farming, animal husbandry, and the delicate balance of ranch life. Eli found himself unexpectedly good at teaching, patient with questions, willing to let kids try their hand at simple tasks, firm but kind when enforcing safety rules. The crowdfunding campaign had done more than raise money. It had connected them with people who cared about what they were building. Volunteers showed up on weekends to help with projects. A retired carpenter taught Eli advanced building techniques. A master gardener spent a Saturday with Diane, sharing decades of knowledge. An accountant offered to help Ruth set up their books properly, no charge. By September, 5 Corners Ranch was profitable. Not wildly so, but enough. Enough to pay expenses, save for winter, plan for expansion. Enough to prove that 5 people with more determination than experience could make something work if they refused to give up. One evening in late September, they gathered on the porch as the sun set, a ritual that had become sacred to them. Eli sat in the chair he'd repaired in March, Clover dozing in the corral nearby. The donkey was 18 now, moving slower, but still stubborn as ever. "Frank asked if we'd be interested in buying some of his breeding stock," Diane said. "He's downsizing and he'd give us a good price." "How good?" Ruth asked, always the accountant. "Good enough that we could afford it and still have operating capital." "Then we should do it," Margot said. "Build our own herd, instead of just raising other people's cattle." They discussed it, weighing options, but the decision was never really in doubt. They'd grown confident in their ability to handle challenges, to work through problems as they arose. Fear no longer paralyzed them. It informed them, guided them, but didn't control them. Later, after the others had gone to bed, Eli found himself alone on the porch with Ruth. She'd brought out Walter's journal, something she did occasionally when she needed to think. "Do you ever wonder what he'd think of all this?" Eli asked. "Every day." Ruth ran her hand over the worn leather cover. "I think he'd be surprised we made it work." Pleased, but surprised. He had more faith in us than we had in ourselves. That's what faith is, Ruth said. Believing in something before there's proof. He believed we'd figure it out, and we did. With a lot of stumbling along the way, Ruth smiled. The best things usually require stumbling. Eli thought about that. About the journey from the auction house to this porch. From a $10 gamble to a thriving ranch. From 5 strangers to something that felt remarkably like family. It hadn't been easy. Nothing worth having ever was. But it had been worth every hard moment, every doubt, every fear overcome. I never thanked you, Eli said suddenly. For what? For not making me leave. That first night, you could have insisted I go. You had every right, and you could have forced us out. You had the legal right. That wouldn't have been right, though. No, Ruth agreed. It wouldn't have been. Which is why we're here now, together, instead of scattered and alone. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars appeared overhead. A cow lowed softly in the distance. Inside, someone, probably Clara, was washing dishes. The sound carrying through the open windows, along with the smell of the bread Margot had baked that afternoon. Walter wrote something near the end of his journal, Ruth said. Want to hear it? Sure. She opened to a page marked with a ribbon. He wrote, "The best legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who you leave behind. If these 5 people can build something together, if they can create family where there was none, then I've done something right. Maybe the only right thing I've done in years. And that's enough. That has to be enough." Eli felt his throat tighten. It was enough. More than enough. He'd be proud of us. We should be proud of ourselves. Ruth closed the journal. We are, even if we don't say it often enough. The next morning, Eli woke early and walked down to the creek. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, the same way it had run for thousands of years and would run for thousands more. The land didn't care who owned it, didn't care about deeds or money or human drama. It simply was, patient and enduring, but the people who lived on it, they cared. They cared about every fence post and garden row, every calf born, and every season survived. They poured their hopes into the soil and their dreams into the work, and slowly, patiently, the land gave back. Eli thought about the $10 bill he'd spent nearly a year ago. He thought about the auction, about sitting in that courthouse basement with no idea that his life was about to change completely. He'd thought he was buying property. Instead, he'd bought a future, a community, a reason to wake up each morning with purpose instead of just routine. Sometimes the best things come from the smallest investments. $10, an open mind, the willingness to share what you thought was solely yours. The courage to stay when leaving would be easier. Behind him he heard footsteps. Clara, coming down for her morning walk. Then Diane heading to check on the cattle. Margot with her camera, documenting the sunrise. Ruth with 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Eli without a word. 5 people who'd started with nothing but loss and desperation, who'd found each other through the strange machinations of a dying man, who'd built something lasting from broken pieces. 5 people standing on land they'd earned together, watching the sun rise over 5 Corners Ranch, ready for whatever came next. And it was good. It was more than good. It was home.